story of Bryan Childers begins in the unforgiving underworld of methamphetamine, prison politics, and white supremacist gangs. A shadow society that thrives on loyalty, fear, and ruthless violence. It's a world that few outsiders truly understand, and one that can consume anyone who drifts too close. Bryan wasn't born into this life. He grew up like many others in small-town America, shaped by the same struggles and temptations that have pulled countless young men toward gangs. Drugs, poverty, broken family ties, these were the pressures weighing on him. And like so many, he found both belonging and danger in the company of outlaws. That outlaw family came in the form of the Aryan Circle, a white supremacist prison gang that was gaining ground in Texas. While the Aryan Brotherhood had long held the reputation as the most feared white prison gang in the country, the Aryan Circle was on the rise, expanding its influence, feeding off the meth trade, and recruiting both behind bars and on the streets. For Bryan, joining the Circle wasn't just a choice, it was survival. The Aryan Circle, like its rivals, promised brotherhood. It offered protection in the brutal hierarchy of prisons, where a man without affiliation could be swallowed whole. But protection came at a cost: absolute loyalty, unquestioned obedience, and a willingness to commit acts of violence in the name of the gang. Once inside, there was no easy way out. For Bryan, the rules of the game quickly became clear. The gang was everything. Every decision, every move had to serve the Aryan Circle's interests. In return, Bryan gained status, recognition, and the dangerous sense of power that came with the patch. But beneath the surface, life in these gangs was never stable. Rivalries festered, paranoia spread, and even a single mistake could spark deadly consequences. Methamphetamine lay at the heart of this volatile world. It was more than a drug. It was currency, control, and survival. The Aryan Circle and the Aryan Brotherhood both relied on meth to fund their operations. They used it to maintain influence both in and out of prison. Dealers on the streets were forced to pay taxes to whichever gang controlled their area, and those who resisted faced intimidation, assault, or worse. And so, as Bryan moved deeper into this world, he became a small part of a much larger machine, one where alliances shifted like sand, and trust could never be taken for granted. The Aryan Circle might have been his brotherhood, but its rivals, the Aryan Brotherhood, were always watching. The Brotherhood was older, larger, and infamous for enforcing its rules with unimaginable cruelty. It was only a matter of time before Bryan found himself caught in the crossfire of these two deadly organizations. His loyalty to the Aryan Circle would ultimately place him in direct opposition to the Aryan Brotherhood. And in the lawless ecosystem of prison gangs, a man in Bryan's position was little more than prey. The trap was set long before Bryan realized it. The Aryan Brotherhood tolerated no threats, no mistakes, and no challenges to their supremacy. If someone stepped out of line or simply ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, the punishment was swift, brutal, and final. For Bryan, the choices he made, the gang he joined, and the life he pursued would lead him down a path with no return. His story is not one of glory, but of descent into a world where loyalty is fleeting, betrayal is common, and death is never far away. The stage was set for one of the most brutal murders in Texas gang history. And when it came, it would not only end Bryan's life, but also tear apart the family he left behind. As his sister, Carrie Childers, would later say, Bryan wasn't perfect, but he was her brother, a man with dreams, flaws, and a family who loved him. What happened to him was more than just gang business. It was a tragedy that exposed the devastating human cost of white supremacist gangs, meth, and the cycle of violence that devours so many lives. The rise of the Aryan Circle brought Bryan into the fold, but that same rise set the stage for his fall, a fall orchestrated by the Brotherhood, who would soon make him pay the ultimate price for breaking the rules. When Bryan Childers crossed the invisible line drawn by gang rules, there was no forgiveness. In the world of prison gangs, even rumors of disloyalty could become a death sentence, whether it was a dispute over drugs, accusations of skimming profits, or simply being on the wrong side of a bitter rivalry. Bryan had, in the eyes of the Aryan Brotherhood, broken the code. And the Brotherhood's code was simple. Betrayal is answered with blood. The Aryan Brotherhood, founded in the 1960s, had built its reputation on violence. Their motto, blood in, blood out, wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration. To enter the Brotherhood, a man often had to shed blood. To leave, the only way out was in a coffin. By the time Bryan found himself in their crosshairs, the Brotherhood had decades of practice in enforcing discipline through fear. Investigators would later piece together the grim sequence of events that led to Bryan's death. He was lured in by men he thought he could trust, men who understood his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, and his loyalty to the Aryan Circle. To Bryan, it might have seemed like just another meeting, another gathering among men who lived by the same codes. But behind the smiles and handshakes was a death sentence already written. The attack itself was as brutal as it was calculated. The Brotherhood wanted to send a message, not just to Bryan, but to anyone who might consider defying them. Violence was their language, and the murder of Bryan Childers was designed to speak volumes. Once he was in their grasp, there was no escape. He was beaten, murdered, and dismembered in a scene so gruesome that even seasoned investigators would later struggle to put words to what they uncovered. The dismemberment wasn't random. It was ritualistic, a method of erasing a man from existence while also amplifying the fear factor among others in the gang world. To cut a man apart was to reduce him to nothing, to strip away not only his life, but his identity. The Brotherhood wanted everyone to know, this is what happens when you cross us. After the murder, the cover-up began. 7 individuals were ultimately charged in connection with Bryan's death. Not only those who carried out the killing, but also those who helped dispose of evidence, silence potential witnesses, and shield the killers from law enforcement. In the culture of gangs, covering up a crime is just as important as committing it. Silence is loyalty. Talking is death. But no cover-up is perfect. As investigators closed in, fragments of the story began to surface. Informants whispered. Associates turned under pressure. And slowly, the horrific details of Bryan's final hours came into focus. For his family, the news was a nightmare. His sister Carrie and his mother June were forced to hear the unimaginable. That Bryan had not only been killed, but mutilated by the very kind of men he once called brothers. It wasn't enough that he was gone. The manner of his death etched an unhealable wound into their lives. The crime shocked not just Bryan's family, but the wider community. It laid bare the brutality of gang life and the extreme measures white supremacist organizations would take to maintain control. Meth and money may have fueled the violence, but the true engine was fear, the need to dominate through sheer savagery. What made Bryan's murder especially chilling was its cold inevitability. In the eyes of the Brotherhood, this wasn't murder, it was enforcement. Just another example of the gang's brutal code, carried out without hesitation. For outsiders, it was an atrocity. For the Brotherhood, it was business as usual. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. Bryan's death wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, a cycle of violence repeated in prisons and small towns across America. Each killing served as a reminder: loyalty to the gang was absolute. Defiance, real or imagined, would be answered with death. As the investigation deepened and charges were brought against the 7 involved, the full scope of the crime began to emerge. But for Carrie Childers and her mother June, no arrest, no trial, and no conviction could undo what had been done. Bryan was gone, his life stolen in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. The Aryan Brotherhood had made its point, and in doing so, it left a trail of devastation that extended far beyond the gang itself, into the hearts of a grieving family, and into the conscience of a nation that continues to wrestle with the violent underbelly of organized crime. When the dust settled after Bryan Childers' murder, what remained was horror and a trail of evidence too large to fully bury. For law enforcement, the case was both familiar and daunting. Familiar, because prison gangs and white supremacist groups had long been on their radar. Daunting, because prying open the silence of such organizations often felt impossible. The Aryan Brotherhood had operated for decades under a code of secrecy. Members lived by the creed that snitches get stitches, or worse, a coffin. The very structure of these gangs relied on silence and intimidation. Witnesses were rare, and even when someone did speak, the fear of retaliation often led to retracted statements or vanishing testimonies. But Bryan's murder was too gruesome, too public within gang circles to remain completely hidden. Whispers traveled fast. As investigators began their work, they traced those whispers, piecing together fragments of testimony, phone records, and forensic evidence. Slowly, the horrifying reality of Bryan's final moments emerged. 7 people were eventually charged in connection with the murder and the cover-up. Some had taken part directly in the killing, others in the aftermath, disposing of evidence, cleaning up the crime scene, or ensuring that law enforcement would hit dead ends. Each arrest chipped away at the Brotherhood's wall of silence, though at great risk to anyone willing to cooperate. The indictments were a significant step, but they could not erase the devastating impact of the crime. For Bryan's sister, Carrie Childers, the news of the arrest brought a complicated mixture of relief and despair. Relief that those responsible were facing justice. Despair that no trial, no prison sentence could bring her brother back. Carrie remembered Bryan, not as the gang member his killers painted him to be, but as her brother. She acknowledged his flaws, his struggles with drugs, his choices that led him down dangerous paths. But in her eyes, he was still family. He wasn't perfect, she later said, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. Their mother, June Smallwood, carried her grief with quiet resilience. Losing a child is every parent's nightmare. Losing one in such a violent, degrading manner is a pain beyond words. For June, the horror of Bryan's murder was not just in the loss, but in the knowledge of how he was taken. Dismembered, discarded, treated as less than human. The community, too, felt the shock. Bryan's death forced an uncomfortable truth into the open. White supremacist gangs weren't confined to prison walls. They were present in rural Texas towns, feeding off the meth trade, recruiting young men, and spreading violence like a plague. What had happened to Bryan could happen to anyone who got too close to the world of gangs and drugs. For investigators and prosecutors, the case became a rallying point. It demonstrated the lengths gangs would go to enforce control and the necessity of pushing back with equal determination. But behind the official statements, there was recognition of the uphill battle. Prison gangs were not going away. Each time law enforcement cut off one head of the Hydra, another grew in its place. The trials themselves revealed the complexity of gang loyalty. Some defendants stood firm, refusing to cooperate, proud even of their role in the killing. Others cracked under pressure, their testimonies shedding light on the Brotherhood's operations, but also painting targets on their backs. To testify against the Brotherhood was to sign one's own death warrant. For Bryan's family, sitting through the legal proceedings was agony. Each detail presented in court reopened wounds that never truly healed. The clinical language of prosecutors, words like dismemberment, body parts, cover-up, clashed with their memories of Bryan as a son and brother. Every hearing was a reminder of how brutally his life had ended. Yet through the pain, Carrie and June found the strength to speak out. They shared their grief publicly, not for attention, but in hopes of showing others the real cost of gang life. Behind every news headline about meth, gangs, or the Aryan Brotherhood, there were families like theirs, broken, grieving, and forever changed. The aftermath of Bryan's murder was not just about the arrests and trials. It was about the scars left behind. Scars on a family forced to live with the loss, scars on a community forced to confront the presence of gangs in their midst, and scars on a justice system reminded once again of the enormity of the fight against prison-based organized crime. The Brotherhood had taken Bryan's life to send a message of dominance, but the message that echoed louder in the halls of the courthouse and in the hearts of those left behind was one of devastation. Violence did not just silence Bryan, it spread outward, destroying lives long after the crime itself. And yet the story did not end with the convictions. Bryan's death would become part of a larger narrative, one that revealed the ongoing war between white supremacist gangs, the meth epidemic that fueled them, and the communities left to pick up the pieces. Bryan Childers' murder was shocking in its brutality, but it was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger disease, one that has taken root in American prisons, spilled onto the streets, and seeped into small towns across the country. To understand what happened to Bryan, one must first understand the violent ecosystem of white supremacist gangs and their relationship to methamphetamine. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Circle are two of the most notorious white prison gangs in America. Though they share similar ideologies of white supremacy and racial domination, they are also bitter rivals. Both emerged in prisons, where racial divisions became survival mechanisms. In an environment where numbers and protection often meant the difference between life and death, gangs like the Brotherhood and the Circle offered inmates a shield at the cost of absolute obedience. But these organizations didn't remain confined within prison walls. Over time, they extended their reach into the outside world, creating networks of dealers, enforcers, and affiliates who operated in rural towns, suburbs, and highways. And at the center of their empire was methamphetamine. Meth became the lifeblood of these gangs for several reasons. Unlike cocaine or heroin, meth could be produced domestically in clandestine labs scattered across the American heartland. It was cheap to make, highly addictive, and incredibly profitable. For gangs looking to fund their operations and exert influence, meth was the perfect vehicle. The Aryan Brotherhood perfected the art of taxation, forcing independent drug dealers to pay a cut of their profits in exchange for protection, or at least the promise of not being targeted. Those who refused often met the same fate as Bryan Childers: intimidation, violence, or death. The Aryan Circle, on the other hand, built its reputation by muscling into territories where the Brotherhood's control was weaker. The overlap between these organizations often turned violent, with men like Bryan caught in the middle. The murder of Bryan Childers, gruesome as it was, fits into this larger pattern. It was not only about punishing one man, but also about reinforcing the rules of a criminal underworld. To betray the gang, to disrespect its authority, or even to simply be aligned with the wrong group at the wrong time, was enough to seal one's fate. His dismemberment sent a clear message: the Brotherhood's rule is absolute. For law enforcement, these gangs present a particularly stubborn challenge. Unlike street gangs that might dissolve with time or leadership arrest, prison gangs are rooted in the correctional system itself. Members who enter prison are often recruited inside, sworn in under oaths of violence, and bound by blood. Even when released, many remain under the control of their gang, carrying out orders from behind prison walls. The overlap between meth distribution and prison gangs makes the challenge even more severe. Meth has ravaged communities across the United States, from rural Texas to small-town Ohio to California's Central Valley. It doesn't discriminate by race, class, or geography. It destroys families, drives crime rates upward, and fills prisons with addicts and dealers alike. For the Aryan Brotherhood and Aryan Circle, meth is more than money. It's leverage. Addicted users become indebted, often forced into servitude for the gang. Dealers, many of them addicts themselves, are easy to control through fear and threats. And communities struggling with addiction become fertile recruiting grounds, where young men searching for belonging find it in the promises of white supremacist gangs. Bryan's death, in this sense, was not just the tragedy of one man. It was a reflection of a system that traps thousands. A young man with a troubled past gets pulled into the orbit of a prison gang. He finds temporary belonging, fleeting protection. But the deeper he goes, the fewer exits remain. And when the rules are broken, even slightly, the punishment is final. The story echoes in countless others across America. Families torn apart by addiction, mothers grieving sons lost to gang violence, communities destabilized by meth labs and violent crime. Bryan's murder captured headlines because of its brutality, but its roots run deeper into a culture of violence that has been festering for decades. Some compare it to the fictional worlds of outlaw biker dramas like Sons of Anarchy. The parallels are there: meth, violence, brotherhood, betrayal. But this isn't television. There are no anti-heroes to root for, no scripted endings. In reality, the violence leaves nothing but devastation in its wake. By the time law enforcement brings cases like Bryan's to court, the damage is already done. A man is dead, a family is broken, a community is shaken, and somewhere, in another prison cell, another order is being given, another cycle beginning. Bryan's death was a headline, but it was also part of a larger story, a national epidemic of gangs, meth, and violence that continues to claim lives, often unnoticed, until the next tragedy makes the news. The murder of Bryan Childers left behind more than just a crime scene. It left behind a family struggling with grief, a community forced to confront the reality of gang violence, and a stark reminder of the human toll of meth and white supremacist gangs. Bryan's story, though unique in its details, carries echoes of countless others lost to the same cycle of loyalty, betrayal, and brutality. For Carrie Childers, the loss of her brother remains raw. She describes missing him in the smallest moments: the phone calls that never come, the laughter that once filled their home, the knowledge that her brother is gone forever. She has been candid about Bryan's flaws, acknowledging his ties to gangs and drugs, But she refuses to let those mistakes define him. To her, he was a brother first, a person with a family who loved him. Their mother, June Smallwood, carries a quieter but no less devastating grief. A parent's worst nightmare is burying a child, and June had to endure that in the most horrific way imaginable. The brutality of Bryan's death deepened the wound, leaving questions that can never be answered. How could men who called themselves brothers treat another human being with such cruelty? Why did loyalty demand his life? These are questions that no trial or conviction could ever satisfy. Bryan's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a message, broadcast through violence, from one gang to another. The Aryan Brotherhood intended his murder to be a warning to his fellow Aryan Circle members, to anyone who might defy them, and to the wider criminal world. This is what happens to those who cross us. That symbolism adds another layer to the pain. Bryan became not just a victim, but a tool in a larger battle for power. His body was used to send a signal, his death exploited as proof of dominance. In many ways, he was dehumanized twice, first by the murder itself, and second by the fact that his death served as propaganda for a gang's reputation. This is where Bryan's story expands beyond his family, and even beyond Texas. It highlights a much larger truth about gang life, that the cycle of violence consumes not only the men who join, but also their families, their communities, and often innocent bystanders. White supremacist gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Circle thrive on methamphetamine and fear. They recruit vulnerable young men, promising protection and belonging. They enforce loyalty through intimidation and brutality. And they leave behind a trail of destruction that rarely makes headlines unless a case is as gruesome as Bryan's. But his story also forces a difficult conversation. How does society respond? Law enforcement can arrest and prosecute. Judges can hand down long sentences. But as long as the prison system serves as an incubator for gangs, and as long as drugs like meth devastate communities, the cycle continues. Bryan's murder was the product of a system that has been running for decades, and dismantling it requires more than arrests. It requires addressing the root causes of addiction, poverty, and the search for belonging that leads men to gangs in the first place. For Carrie and June, the fight continues in quieter ways. By sharing their story, they ensure that Bryan is remembered not just for the gang he joined, but for the life he lived and the family he left behind. Their voices cut through the sensational headlines to reveal the human side of the story, the side that hurts the most. The legacy of violence left by Bryan's murder is twofold. On one hand, it is the legacy of the Brotherhood's cruelty, a demonstration of the extremes gangs will go to enforce control. On the other hand, it is the legacy of resilience shown by the family left behind. They carry the burden of grief, but they also carry Bryan's memory, refusing to let it be defined solely by the men who killed him. Bryan Childers' story is not a cautionary tale with a neat ending. It is an open wound, a reminder of the destructive power of gangs and meth in America. His life and death show us how quickly choices can spiral, how loyalty can become a weapon, and how violence spreads like a disease, infecting families and communities far beyond the men who commit it. In the end, Bryan's name stands among too many others, lives lost to the prison gang world, lives consumed by the meth trade, lives destroyed in the name of brotherhood. His story forces us to ask, how many more families must endure what Carrie and June endured before the cycle is broken? The final image lingers, a family photo of Bryan smiling before the darkness overtook him, fading into silence. A life cut short. A reminder that in the world of gangs, loyalty is paid in blood, and the cost is always too high.